All right, guys. Welcome to the beginning of our social movements unit. During this unit, we're going to look at a couple of different movements in U.S. history that have impacted our society as a whole and led us to what we know today as our modern American society. The first movement that we're going to start with is obviously the American Revolution. Well, that's a war. Some of you might ask, well, that's a war. But really what you're looking at is the impacts that society had in the 13 colonies prior to the actual war itself. Okay, I know when you think of the Revolution, you think of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, but there are actually a lot of things that happened between the British and the colonists within 20 plus years that lead up to that revolution, and those are some of the things that we're going to look at today. All right, so the first thing that we're going to look at is the French and Indian War, which is also known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, that is fought between not the French and the Indians, but the British and the French, who have been rivals for as long as either country has existed. However, the French and Indian War takes place in America because both powers have colonies in the New World, and it's basically become a struggle between the two to see who's going to have dominance within the Western Hemisphere. Eventually, the British win. They forced the French to completely vacate their colonies. That obviously sets up eventually Thomas Jefferson being able to purchase Louisiana from the French. But as a result, the French still have a presence in America, but not as strongly as they did prior to that. Great Britain is then able to reestablish trade with the Native Americans, but they also find themselves in a lot of debt. And a lot of the debt they believe is caused by protecting the colonists. And so they feel that the colonists have a responsibility to pay for the war debt that has been accrued as a result of that war. And so what you see is Parliament, which is kind of like Congress for the United States in Great Britain, passes a series of taxes that the colonists are not too happy about. And some of the more namely ones, like you see down here, are the Navigation Acts, the Sugar Act, and the Quartering Act. Okay, obviously the Navigation Act has to do with who the colonists are able to trade with. The Sugar Act is a basic tax on sugar itself, and then the Quartering Act actually forces colonists in the New World to house and take care of British soldiers. And the reason behind that is that the British believe that those soldiers are stationed there to protect those colonists, and as a result, that's the colonists doing their part in helping the empire protect itself and maintain itself. Okay. Also, looking at the biggest piece of legislation that Parliament passes, then that you begin to see build tension. Obviously, we talked about the French and Indian War and the need to tax to pay off debt for the British. Then you see the Proclamation Line of 1763 that we've talked about over and over again in class. Now we're actually going to get into the actual taxes themselves, and the largest one that begins to see that tension build as far as identifying themselves as Americans and colonists, and then looking at the British, is the stamp tax. And basically the Stamp Act, like it says up here, 1765, generated the most protests in the colonies because it mandates the use of stamp paper or the affixing of stamps certifying payment of the tax. Okay, so that means that anything that you print on paper, newspapers, advertisements, anything that is circulated, books, anything like that, any piece of mail, it has to have a specific symbol from the British Crown saying that that person has paid a particular tax. As you can imagine, think of all the things that we use paper, even with the influx of technology today. Think of all the things that we use paper today for, and how much money that would cost if you had to pay a tax on every single piece of paper that you used or used to send to somebody, things like that. As it says down there in the fourth bullet, both the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act provided for offenders to be tried in the Admiralty courts where defenders were guilty until proven innocent. So not only are you paying a tax, but if you refuse to pay that tax, you are imprisoned. And like it says up there, you're guilty until proven innocent. And as you can see, when we get into kind of the list of grievances, talking about the Declaration, things like that, it really sets up the United States for having our laws the way that we do. Like our justice system, you are innocent until proven guilty. A lot of those concepts come from the way that the British treated the colonists prior to independence. Okay, this right here is just an example of what that stamp would have looked like. The royal stamp, things like that. So you would have actually had to have a stamp like this on any piece of paper that you were using during that time period. And if you didn't, you were subject to fines and imprisonment if you did not pay that tax. This, like I said, this caused such an uproar that the colonists actually create a legislative body known as the Stamp Act Congress. And basically what it does is it allows the colonists to cause such a social upheaval that the British feel that they have to repeal the Stamp Act. That doesn't mean that they're done taxing the colonists, obviously, but as a result, they feel like they have to take that Stamp Act away. As it says there at the bottom, some colonists agreed to boycott supplies, instead making their own homemade wool and cloth and refusing to buy British goods. And if you know anything about mercantilism, which was the economic system during this time period, the whole goal of the colony's existence was to provide Great Britain with raw materials, and then Britain would sell those manufactured goods back to the colonists to stockpile gold and silver, because that's what made you a powerful country during this time period. But if they're not getting that gold and silver from the colonists, they are decreasing their power. So you can begin to see the problem for the British, but you can also see the issues and the concepts that the colonists are coming up with as ways to protest what they view as unjust laws being put on them by the Parliament and the King from Great Britain. Like I said at the beginning with the stamp tax, Americans felt that they were unfairly taxed for an unnecessary army because they felt that the French army was defeated, the Native Americans had been defeated, so why do we have to not only house soldiers but also pay for them to be here? And this is where you begin to see the famous battle cry, no taxation without representation, because Parliament is taxing these colonists, but they're not allowed to have representatives in the legislative body in Great Britain as well. Also, any legislation any legislative body in the colonies is subject to being shut down by the British if they don't agree with the way that body is operating. This is really the beginning point of when you see Great Britain begin to meddle within the colonies, and that's what causes all the tension. Whereas in the 1600s, the 1619 to 1620, you see the House of Burgesses established in Virginia. For almost 100 years, the colonies are allowed to govern themselves, and really you begin to see a lot of pushback from the colonists when Great Britain feels that now they're going to pass laws that the colonists, one, don't have a voice in, and two, as a result of not having that voice, they feel that it's unjust. Part of the protest that develops, you begin to see groups that are known as Sons and Daughters of Liberty. As indicated by the picture at the right there, you see colonists that basically terrorize any tax collector or British tax collector. They would be hung in effigy, they would be tarred and feathered. Like it says there at the very bottom, though, all this upheaval leads to Parliament repealing the Stamp Act, but eventually they passed what is known as the Declaratory Act, proclaiming that Parliament had the right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever, and basically drawing that line in the sand right there. Okay, obviously there's a clear point to where the colonists and the British are on opposing sides, and they're set up for this conflict. Okay, the Revolutionary War starts 9 to 10 years after all of this occurs. And so you begin to see, like I said, it didn't just get to 1774 and 1776 and all of a sudden we decide that we're just going to randomly send the Declaration of Independence and we're just going to randomly declare our independence from Great Britain to the point that we're willing to fight for it. This is a period of 10, 15, 20 years that this tension is built up. Moving forward to where tensions increase even further is the implementation of the Townshend Tea Tax, which leads to the Boston Tea Party, and then eventually, obviously, the Boston Massacre, which is viewed as kind of the turning point of the Revolutionary War, the beginning point of that, because that's the first time that blood is officially spilled between colonists and British soldiers. Okay, looking at the Townshend Acts was obviously introduced by a man known as Charles Townshend, who was a prominent figure in Parliament at the time, imposed these taxes that, like it says up there, put light taxes on lead, paper, paint, and tea. Also, as a result of the New York legislature refusing to comply with the Quartering Act, that colonial legislature is then suspended. Like I said, colonial legislatures were basically up to the decision point of the king and parliament as to how they ruled. If king and parliament did not agree with the way that they ruled their colony or governed their colony, they could not only be suspended, but they could basically have their charter revoked. And that's what you end up seeing to multiple colonies before the revolution begins. Like it says down there in red, if you can see, it says, in protest, the colonies refused to pay the tax or simply smuggled it in, talking about those goods of lead, paper, paint, and tea. So as a result of colonial opposition, the Brits sent troops to America to enforce the law. And so, like I said, that's really the buildup. So you begin to see the French and Indian War, the Proclamation of 1763, the beginning of what the colonists view as unjust taxes because they're being taxed without representation, hence the phrase no taxation without representation. And that's where you begin to see the buildup and the tensions boil over. And as you can see, as we get to 1767, 1770 with the Boston Massacre, eventually we get to the Declaration of Independence, and then eventually the battles at Lexington and Concord, and that's the official begin of the Revolution. Okay, the Boston Massacre. All right, I have this painting hanging in my classroom behind my desk, which is Paul Revere's imprint. And there's two different sides based on this. Obviously, like it says up there, on the evening of March 5th, 1770, a crowd of about 60 townspeople in Boston were harassing some 10 redcoats. So it's not as one-sided as Paul Revere's imprint declares. This is pretty much the first form of propaganda that is given out. And the goal of it being that the colonists are seen as peaceful protesters or just a regular group in the town square, and the British soldiers are clearly the aggressors here. If you were to Google this image, you would see the other image that there is clearly colonists that are harassing, throwing rocks, screaming obscenities at the British troops, and it's kind of a two-sided affair that nobody knows who fired the first shot, but everybody knows that this is basically the beginning of bloodshed. The first person to die as a result of the revolution is Crispus Attucks, who was a former slave and basically was the leader of the mob in the Boston Massacre. I apologize. Obviously, this is the picture of the Continental Congress, where you see the Declaration of Independence being signed. You see prominent figures like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, and like I said, you don't just come and decide, okay, it's been a year, we're being unjustly taxed, things like that. The Declaration was not the first time that the colonists had tried to appeal to the king. Okay, it even says in the list of grievances that Thomas Jefferson compiles based on common sense from Thomas Paine that the colonists has continuously asked the king to repeal these taxes or to change these taxes, as it repeatedly talked or asked and requested that British soldiers be held accountable for their action in the colonies, and that has gone unheard and eventually leads to the Declaration of Independence being signed. The committees of correspondence is a huge part of this social movement. All right, this is behind the efforts of people like Samuel Adams. Okay, and what you see is these committees of correspondence are basically act as a communication system between each of the 13 colonies. And what they're able to do is it's a way to push not only literature but also propaganda to each of the colonies to gain support for the revolutionary movement. And so what you see is these colonists begin to band together and form an identity, whereas before they were 13 separate colonies. Now they're starting to come together and identify themselves as Americans, as the American colonies, instead of just 13 different sub-countries. All right. This is just some more information about the committees of correspondence. Like I said, leaders like Samuel Adams, as you can see to the left, that would be a picture of Mr. Adams as well. And it defines the committees of correspondence as a network of letter writers and the forerunner to the Continental Congress, where we see the Declaration of Independence drafted. And like I said, it's basically the idea of which you begin to build support for this revolution, and it's the way that those colonies communicate with one another within that system. All right. The Boston Tea Party. All right. Some of you may be looking at this and wondering, why are there Native Americans on this ship? I thought the colonists did that. And we're going to get into that in a minute. But there are a lot of modern day correlations between the Boston Tea Party and present day. If you look at the Tea Party today in Congress, that is basically a right-wing conservative branch of the Republican Party. Yes, Republicans are conservative. There's an even further conservative branch of that known as the Tea Party, with members like our Senator, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, former Representative Michelle Bachmann, like a former vice presidential candidate of 2008, Sarah Palin, but we'll get into that towards the end. But looking at the Boston Tea Party as a result of these as the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Quartering Act, the Townsend Acts, this is basically the first form of protest by the colonists, okay? And we're going to look at, like I just kind of explained, why did the Boston Tea Party take place? Why did colonists feel like they had to dress up as Native Americans, storm on into Boston Harbor onto British ships, and literally dump tons of tea into Boston Harbor? And we're going to look at the effects of that as well. Just another image, like it says there at the bottom, Americans throwing the cargoes of the tea ships into the river at Boston. So as we get into this, like it says in 1773, the British East India Company, which is basically the background of a lot of corruption at this time period, the British basically set up their colonial system to bail out that East India Company, or the tea company at least. Like it says up there, the company had 17 million pounds of unsold tea and was facing bankruptcy, and as a result, the British grant that company a monopoly. There's a word that we've talked about in the 1800s when we talked about the robber barons with Carnegie and Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and Morgan. Again, a monopoly is a company that basically dominates an entire industry without competition, which is a bad thing. All right. And so as a result, they begin to let the British East India Company create this monopoly and forcing Americans to buy that tea as a result. And what you see is these committees of correspondence, especially, like I said, the Sons of Liberty, Daughters of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, like you can see there, happens in December 16th of 1773, disguise themselves as Indians or Native Americans, opened 342 chests of tea, and dumped the tea into Boston Harbor, and that was how it becomes known as the Boston Tea Party. All right. Like it says here, this is not the only protest to occur. This is the most famous example. This is not the only protest that occurs during this time period. All right. Like it says, you see up and down the seaboard, there were many colonial protests. Ultimately, no tea was taken out of their respective harbors. People in Annapolis, Maryland did the same and burned the ships to water level. Reaction of these protests was varied throughout the colonies, from approval to outrage. Again, we have a lot of colonists that still identify themselves as British citizens, and that's the people that we become known as loyalists or British loyalists. We see obviously the rebels and the loyalists, and we'll talk about them a little bit more when we go through our review unit talking about the Revolutionary War. As a result of the Boston Tea Party, Parliament decides to implement a punishment on the colonists known as the Intolerable Acts. Okay? Like it says up there in 1774, as a reaction to the Boston Tea Party, the Parliament passes a series of repressive acts to punish the colonies, namely Massachusetts. These were known by the colonists as the Intolerable Acts. Okay? They followed this portion. The Boston Port Act closes Boston Harbor. Self-government was limited by forbidding town hall meetings without approval. Obviously, you have to get approval from either the governor, the British governor in the colony, or the crown itself. And then Massachusetts actually had its colonial charter revoked. Okay, so obviously these are things that are viewed as very poorly, things that are viewed as revenge against the colonists and aren't taken very lightly. Another part of this is the Quebec Act is passed, which actually extends the charter of the colony of Quebec in Canada. And if you look at this right here, Quebec, like I said, is right here in Canada, and what you see is the British redraw the lines, basically giving Canadian Quebec all this territory, including the Northwest. So when we talk about the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, this is the territory that the British refused to vacate, but this territory goes all the way down to the top of Kentucky. This is the Ohio River, and then it shoots right back up. All right, so they extend the Charter of Quebec. This threatens the colonies because this is a major Catholic colony, and a lot of colonists not only feel threatened by their land, but they also do not identify themselves as Catholics. The majority of colonists at this time are Protestants, and so they view this as a direct threat on two fronts: one, based on their religion, but two, also more importantly, based on their territory. And they are not allowed to cross this line because this is the proclamation line of 1763, and it goes all the way up. And so what had previously been designated as Native American land is now all of a sudden another British colony's land. And so you begin to see these colonists, even if there were some that doubted the cause of the revolution, the further and further the British go to punish the colonists, the more and more support that they have as a result of these intolerable acts to build for their cause. Okay. As a result of these intolerable acts, the First Continental Congress is called in Philadelphia, September 5th to October 26th of 1774. Like it says in red there, the First Continental Congress met to discuss problems and address colonial grievances. They did not want independence. That was not the goal of this initially, okay? 12 of the 13 colonies met, and only Georgia didn't have a representative there. And they also devised a Declaration of Rights. So we begin to see a precursor to the Declaration of Independence, okay? And this is the first time that you begin to see a call for a complete boycott of British goods, which would obviously undermine the entire British system of mercantilism, okay? Remember, most wars are fought as a result of money or land and power. Okay, and so obviously we're negating Britain's power because we're taking away their money, and they're also being threatened by losing territory in a new world, all right, which has vast natural resources that the British need to desperately get their hands on, because Great Britain is an island. The only way that an island has natural resources, just like Japan in World War II, is to expand to other countries. Okay, the Continental Congress agrees to meet again in 1775 if nothing is resolved. Obviously, nothing is resolved, so they do meet again. And like it says down here, sadly, fighting and bloodshed would become inevitable as once again the king and Parliament simply ignored the Congress's pleas. So this is another example of a united front talking to the king directly and Parliament directly, asking to have a reconciliation, basically, and that falls on deaf ears. And so we begin to see more and more tension build. Okay, obviously the shot heard around the world is the beginning of that revolution. The Declaration of Independence is sent to the King of England. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and when it becomes time for a people to basically cut ties with the British, this is basically the mark of the beginning of the revolution. All right, and so what you end up seeing is the Declaration of Independence drafted. It famously starts out with, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Basically saying in plain English, not only are we going to separate from you, but we're going to tell you why. All right, and the British response to that is to send more troops to the colonies as a result of these protests, as a result of the declaration, and you begin to see the colonists obviously prepare for this oncoming war. The story of Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. That has been debated, true or false, whether or not that actually occurred. And there's many different tales to be told about Paul Revere, but we won't get too in depth because we're basically talking about the social movements. Like it says here, obviously this is a map of where British troops advance into, obviously trying to storm the militia's arsenal at Lexington and then eventually at Concord, which are known as, like I said, the shot heard around the world, and basically the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Okay, and this again would be an artist rendering of that battle there. For the first couple years of the revolution, the colonists pretty much spend it getting their butts kicked until they're able to be organized. Valley Forge is really viewed as pretty much the turning point, the Battle of Saratoga, and then eventually Valley Forge is the turning point of the Revolutionary War under the command of General George Washington, who eventually becomes our first president. They are then able to turn the tide and basically outlast the British in what becomes known as basically a war of attrition, because obviously the British could continue to fight, but one, it's 3,000 miles away. It's costing British taxpayers lots of money. Lots of soldiers' lives are being spent as a result. A lot of resources are being wasted when they feel like there are greater threats, not only at home, but also abroad with France. You begin to see the expansion of other countries into their colonial world. So they also have, they have China, which we look at with the open door policy in the 1800s. They have Africa and India. They begin to build their empire outside of the United States as a response to the colonial uprising. But that doesn't happen again until later on. Obviously, the revolution continues on for a number of years. Just some humor real quick. Paul Revere, his doppelganger, if some of you would, is Jack Black. I have decided that. But looking at influence today of this social movement of the revolution, okay, I had talked about previously about the Tea Party, and it's the idea is that it returns the Republican Party to its original roots, its conservative roots. The goal of the Tea Party, or at least what they say it is to return the United States government to its original purpose, meaning that it is to merely govern on a very basic level. They are very much against how large our government has become, but you also have to look at it understanding that as the country evolves, the level of government involvement also has to evolve. So we do not live in the time period of the 1700s and the 1800s where a small government obviously had issues from the beginning, and that's the reason that has been built up. But the main goal of the Tea Party is basically to strip the government down of any entitlement programs, as it says there, to opposes any government spending projects, Obamacare, the 2009 stimulus package, welfare, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all of those types of things they feel like need to be cut out and let basically the U.S. government be trimmed down to its most basic form. The only thing that contradicts that is that these people believe in war over international liberalism. Now, they're against government spending, but the majority of U.S. debt has been basically piled up, especially over the last couple years, because of wars that we fight. The Iraq War itself cost over $1 trillion, and so that's kind of controversial and counteractive of what they view as the U.S. role of government. Okay, like I said previously, we have modern representatives of that Tea Party, Ron Paul, who had been a previous presidential candidate, Senator Ted Cruz, that shouldn't say of Kentucky, it should say of Texas, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, Sarah Palin, the 2008 vice presidential candidate, and Representative Michelle Bachmann of Minnesota. Okay. We'll look at this a little bit more in depth in class. We could talk about it. If you have any questions over the weekend, please feel free to email me. All right, you can reach me on Twitter as well. You can get on Edmodo. The good thing about starting to flip this class and have these lectures online is that you are able to look back and listen and slow down and review and take notes as much as you want to. And so that's really the benefit of doing this, and that's why I'm moving more towards that so that we can have a more discussion-based outlook within the classroom. And so I really hope that you enjoyed this. I hope you get a lot out of it. Like I said, this is also great for review, and we'll do this periodically for the rest of the year. Thanks, guys.